The boy was chained to a wooden target at the front of the lecture hall. Metal cuffs bit into his wrists. His head hung low, hair falling over his eyes. Not one person in that hall would look him in the face. 400 students filled the seats behind him, and every single one of them knew what was about to happen. A boy with the smile of a prince stood in the aisle and gave the order. His name was Manon, and he ran the middle rank of the school. He clapped his hands twice. A cart of practice orbs was wheeled forward. The rules were simple. Each student would take one orb and throw it at the boy tied to the target. Whoever missed on purpose would be next up on the pole. A girl went first. She was crying. She threw wide, deliberately, and Manon marked her name in a small notebook. A boy after her did not miss. His orb struck the tied boy in the forehead and left a red mark. Laughter rippled through the seats. At the back of the hall, a small student with blonde hair watched all of this without moving. He was scrawny. He was 7th class, which meant nothing here. He looked like a strong breeze could break him. His name was Rude Krishi, and he had been in this school for a total of 3 days. He raised his hand. Manon smiled at him. The whole room turned. Rude walked down the aisle at his own pace. Someone handed him an orb. He weighed it in his palm. He looked at the chained boy once, then back at the reinforced target board behind him. That board was built to stop first-class attacks. It had eaten 100 hits without a crack. He drew back his arm and threw. The board turned to dust. Not a hole, not a break. Dust. It rained down onto the chained boy's shoulders like gray snow. The cuffs at his wrists dropped free and hit the floor. A perfect ring of silence swallowed the lecture hall. Rude reached out and lifted a second orb from the cart. His face did not change. He turned to Manon and said in the softest voice that his hand must have slipped. Then he asked, very politely, whether Manon would mind standing where the tied boy had been. Now stop, because this is not the beginning. The scrawny nobody who just erased a first-class training target is not what he seems. His name is only Rude Krishi to the people in that room. To the rest of the empire, he has a different name, and it is a name people say quietly, if they say it at all. He is a mage the state is actively hunting. He is the kind of mage that other Class 1 veterans train for years to survive one fight with. He is called Blow, and this school he just walked into is not a school. It is a trap that has not been sprung yet. Half his professors are hunters. His roommate is hiding something the world would burn cities to find. His best friend is not human. The bullies in this hall are the smallest problem he has, and he has less than 3 days before the first real enemy figures out who he is. Let's back up. The story begins in a city bright with music, on a night when monsters came through the roof of a concert hall. Thousands had packed the seats to hear the Empire's most famous singer, a woman called Saren. Guards stood at every door. Magical barriers hummed over the roof. Nothing was supposed to get through those wards. Halfway through her opening song, the roof came off. 3 creatures dropped through the hole. They were tall and wrong, with skin like cracked leather and too many arms. The barriers had done nothing to them. Guards drew swords and were dead in seconds. Saren froze at her microphone. The audience stampeded for the doors and clogged them. One of the creatures stepped over a fallen guard and reached for the stage. A man in dark clothes was already standing on the front row. He had not been there a moment before. Tall, coat wrapped tight, black hair falling into pale eyes. He walked up onto the stage as if he were crossing his own living room. He lifted one hand. Black haze poured out of it. The haze wrapped the 3 monsters where they stood. It ate them from the outside in. No sound, no blood, no bones. In under 2 seconds, nothing was left of any of them but a fine dark smoke drifting toward the broken roof. The man turned to Saren. He did not ask if she was all right. He asked, quietly, for her autograph. She stared. Then she scribbled her name on the back of a music sheet with a shaking hand and pushed it into his palm. He tucked the paper into his coat and walked off the stage. Half the audience already had their phones out. None of the photos would come out clear. That was Blow. That was the man Ophion had built its reputation on. And the same night, in a dusty little office across the city, that same man was arguing with his boss over a poster. The office was cluttered, warm, full of people who did not fear Blow at all. A large man with a booming voice, the master of Ophion, the man who owned the guild, held up the poster. On it was a painting of Blow himself, done from a distance, coat billowing, hand raised. Underneath it read, "Hire the Black Mage." First price on the market. Blow was not standing in his tall form now. Back inside the office, he was small, thin, no more than 10 years old to look at. Blonde hair, wide eyes. This was also Rude Krishi. The tall, dark figure was a shape he wore for work. Rude wanted the poster torn down. His boss refused. Real money had gone into that poster. They fought about it the way family fights, with a long history of fighting behind them. Ren, a calm young woman with light hair, watched from a desk in the corner without looking up. She was Ophian's other veteran. She had learned years ago not to get between the two of them. The master ended the argument by handing Rude a folder. New job, urgent. The auction of a top-tier magic stone, Shazam's Heart. Every serious mage in the Empire would attend. The client did not care about the stone. The client cared about a man called Dan, a third-class mage suspected of hiding a snake-shaped criminal tattoo on his leg. The proof would be the tattoo. The task, the master said with a straight face, was to expose it. Publicly, in front of the room. Rude read the assignment twice. He asked what expose meant, exactly. His boss smiled and said Rude would need to pull the man's pants down. Ren put her face into her hands. Blow, one of the most feared mages in the Empire, had been hired to pull down a man's trousers at an auction. Before the folder closed, the master's tone changed. The clowning fell out of his voice for one small line. He told Rude to be careful at that hall. The association had been asking questions again. They knew a black mage was operating. They did not know his face. They did not know his age. But every month they were tightening the net, and this auction would have their best hunters in the room. He called Rude precious family and turned away before either of them had to hold the look. Rude tucked the folder under his arm and left. Ren watched him go and said nothing. The auction hall was carved out of the top floor of an old opera house, gold everywhere. A crystal chandelier the size of a carriage hung above rows of velvet chairs. On stage sat a small glass case with a red stone glowing softly inside. That was Shazam's heart. Behind the case stood two mages in matching uniforms. One had a wolf's ears twitching under his hair. The other had a shock of red hair and a smile that had nothing kind in it. Van and Shik Muan. Class 1, both of them. The association's finest, sent to guard the stone. The seats filled up. In one row sat a tall, silver-haired duke and his small blonde son, a boy called Lapis, who could not stop staring at the mages on stage. Further back sat a princess of the Empire named Tessie, hair blue as deep water, wearing a smile that suggested she had come for entertainment more than the stone. Somewhere among the guests, in a plain gray suit, sat Dan. Rude had already spotted him. Rude had already begun to think about how one might get a grown man out of his trousers in a room full of nobility without starting a war. He did not have time to work it out. Two figures crashed through the tall windows in a shower of glass. Amateurs, robed, masked, shouting demands. They grabbed the auctioneer and put a knife to his throat. Van yawned. He walked across the stage, waved a hand once, and both robed men crumpled soundlessly. It was so easy the crowd felt embarrassed. A few people laughed, unsure if it was polite. Then Shikmuan lifted the glass case off the stone and dropped Shazam's heart into his own palm. The room fell quiet in a different way. He held the stone up between two fingers and looked out across the seats. He did not smile. He said, loud enough for every person in the hall to hear, that he knew Blow was in this room. He said Blackie, and the word rippled through the crowd like a slur. He said he wanted the black mage to come get his stone. He said he had been waiting a long time to feel that particular fear again, and he would take it even if he had to burn the hall down to get it. The audience stopped breathing. Some of them stood to leave. Van closed his eyes at his partner's back. Princess Tessie laughed once. It was a bright, ugly sound. She rose from her seat, still smiling, and swept one arm forward. An enormous wall of ice erupted from the marble floor and shattered the angel statue above the stage. Shik Muan turned toward her, his own hand blooming with fire. The chandelier began to sway. While two Class 1 mages sized each other up over the stone, Rude got up from his seat and walked calmly toward the exit like every other guest. On his way past Dan's row, he leaned in and whispered to a very rich woman that he had it on good authority the third-class mage 2 rows back had smuggled Shazam's heart out under his clothes when the case opened. He whispered the same thing to a small merchant. He whispered it again to a bored young lord. By the time he reached the door, the rumor was moving like fire in dry grass. Dan was mobbed by a wave of shouting nobles inside a minute. Hands went for his belt. He was thrown to the ground. Dan snarled, and his eyes flashed the deep purple of an awakening. Lightning burst from his skin. Nobles were flung across chairs. He tore his shirt off and stood up over the wreckage, roaring that the stone was his, that he had earned it, that no one would take it. In doing so, he confirmed the mission for Rude. The stone was in Dan's pants, which meant so was the tattoo. Rude was already moving. He crossed the aisle at a walk and caught Dan's wrist mid-swing. Something small and quiet passed between them, and Dan folded. He hit the floor with a wet thud. Rude, calm as a librarian, undid the belt, dropped the trousers to the man's ankles, and made sure everyone in the front rows could see the crawling snake tattoo on his thigh. The mission was done. The auction was not. Shikmuan's head snapped around before Rude's fingers had left the belt. The fire in his palm went out. Every drop of playfulness left his face. He had felt something. Somewhere in the hall, someone had used the exact same brand of mana that had once left him shaking on a battlefield years ago. He forgot Princess Tessie entirely. He forgot the stone. He turned toward the crowd and let his mana out in a low, hard pressure that made teeth ache. His eyes locked on the small, dark-haired figure standing over Dan. Rude looked up. Their eyes met across the wrecked hall. That was the exact moment purple circles bloomed on the floor. The circles were delicate, spidery, and wrong. They spread across the marble and climbed the walls. Even the ceiling grew them. Something dark leaked up from the seams between tiles. The chandelier swung on its own. The auctioneer, the guards, the wounded nobles all began to breathe in short, shallow pulls, as if the air itself had started to thin. The first tentacle came up through the aisle floor. It was black, wet, sectioned like a worm and thick as a horse's neck. Another burst through the wall behind the stage. Another dropped from the ceiling. They had no eyes. They had no mouths in any place a mouth belonged. What they had, when they touched a person, was a kind of pull. A rich woman screamed once. A tentacle brushed her arm, and her scream went thin, then silent, and she sagged like her bones had been drawn out through her fingers. Her mana was gone. Her body kept breathing. That was worse. Rude understood in a single heartbeat. These things had no cores. Cutting them did nothing. They were built to drain, and they had been laid over the entire auction like a net, waiting for exactly this crowd of powerful mages to gather in one room. This had never been about a stone. Ren was already at his shoulder. She had come in through the same door he had, and she was pulling a bow of pure light out of her palm. She fired 3 shots in quick succession, and 3 tentacles crisped at the point of impact. It bought maybe seconds. Behind them, Lapis, the small blonde duke's son, was on the ground with his hands over his head, cut off from his father by a tentacle the width of a tree trunk. Rude reached the boy in 2 steps and lifted him under one arm. Lapis was too shocked to protest. He simply held on. Shikmuan was still coming. He walked through the tentacles as if they were smoke. Anything that touched him burned away. His eyes had not left Rude even once. Ren pulled a small folded paper out of her belt. A teleport scroll. Rated for 4. She yelled at Rude to move. He moved. Ren, Rude, Lapis, and a stranger she pulled in by the coat pressed into the scroll's small circle. The paper flared white. The last thing Rude saw before the auction hall vanished was Shikmuan reaching out one hand across the length of the room, fire climbing his arm, and the chandelier finally coming down. The hall exploded behind them. They landed in a back street half a city away. Ren staggered against a wall. Lapis burst into tears in Rude's arms and then, apologetic, tried to stop crying and failed. The stranger they had accidentally saved wandered off in a daze and did not look back. Sirens rang out across the rooftops. A column of black smoke climbed the sky where the opera house used to be. On a tree branch a mile away, a small girl with hair the color of raspberry sat cross-legged. She was not more than 12 to look at. She held Shazam's heart in her fingers. She had lifted it out of Shikmuan's grip during the tentacle chaos without him noticing, which should not have been possible for anyone alive. She examined the stone with the boredom of a shopper choosing an apple. Then she closed her hand. Red dust sifted out between her fingers and drifted away on the wind. Top-tier magic stone. Empty as sand, she sighed. Humans, she said quietly to no one, were so dull. She was not human. Her name was Ruby Meister, and the auction had gone exactly according to her plan. Rude came back to the office at dawn. His boss stood in the middle of the main room, reading the incident report and pretending it was a comedy. He announced that Blow had reportedly clashed with Shik Muan of the association and immediately congratulated Rude on making enemies with the strongest fire mage on the continent. Ren, cleaning her bow at her desk, told him to shut up. The master ignored her. He said the auction house was a smoking crater. He said Shazam's heart was gone. He said the association would spend the next month tearing the city apart looking for the black mage. And then his voice dropped, and he said, without looking up, that they needed to hide Rude for a while. Ren looked up. Rude did too. His boss turned the page. He said he had already hidden him. He had done it months ago, before any of this. There was a country estate school called Helios Academy, the Empire's most exclusive, where the richest and most talented young mages went to be trained. He had bribed his way through the entrance exams and enrolled a very small, very frail 7th-class student under the name Rude Krishi, a sickly boy who had scraped a perfect score, a prodigy nobody would look at too closely, because nobody expected genius from a body that fragile. The bribe had been enormous. It had also, the master added, been paid in advance from the fees of a client who had arrived that morning and would like to speak with Ophian directly. The client walked in on cue. Tall woman, elegant, tired around the eyes, silk gloves, silver hair pulled back. Behind her walked a white-armored knight whose eyes never stopped moving. This was Duchess Dana Arshan of House Arshan, one of the great families of the Empire, and her personal knight, Lispin. The Duchess did not sit. She looked at the master, and she looked at the small blonde boy standing beside him, and she said in a very calm voice that she needed protection for her second son. His name was Letisis. He was 15 years old. He was a student at Helios, and the school was killing him. She did not mean literally. Not yet. What she meant was that Letisis had been cast out. Some years ago, the children of the Empire's noble houses had decided that he was cursed. That there was something inside him that was not human. They called him abomination in the hallways. They arranged small accidents. Teachers looked away. The other great house at the school, House Hidelio, had made him their favorite target, and their heir Chevelle led the pack. The Duchess had tried to bring her son home. Letisis refused to leave. He told her, in the softest voice, that if he came home he would only bring the sickness there. She had run out of ideas. Ophian was the last one. She wanted a mage on the inside of Helios, close to her son, invisible. Someone who could stop the small accidents before they became large ones. Someone who could be a friend, if her boy would take one. Her eyes went to Rude. She had been told, she said, that Ophian had a young member with a talent for going unseen. Rude looked up at his master. His master looked back with the expression of a man who had known this was coming since long before either of them sat down. That was how Rude Krishi, sickly 7th class, was enrolled at Helios Academy. That was how Blow, the black mage of Ophian, ended up sleeping in the room next to the most bullied boy in the Empire. And that was 3 days ago. Helios sat on a green hill outside the capital, marble spires, ivy on the walls. A gate manned by 2 guards who did not spare a second glance at the small blonde boy stepping down from a public carriage with a plain trunk. Rude went in on foot. Nothing in his walk suggested a person who had, 1 week earlier, stood on a stage above 3 dead monsters and asked a singer for her autograph. The dormitory was old stone with narrow windows. His assigned room was on the east side, ground floor. His assigned roommate was already listed on the door. That was the first sign his cover would be tested harder than the master had promised. The name on the door was Letisis von Arshan. Rude knocked. He waited. He knocked again. The door opened a crack, and a pair of dark eyes looked out at him with no expression at all. Letisis was taller than Rude by a full head, thin, black-haired, with the kind of face that had spent a long time hiding. He looked at the roommate paperwork in Rude's hand. He looked at Rude's small trunk. He said quietly that Rude should ask for a different room. Rude said he liked this one. He walked past Letisis, set his trunk on the empty bed, and did not look back. Letisis stared at him for a long moment. Then he closed the door. The other student who found Rude that afternoon was harder to shake. His name was Dio. Blue hair, wide, easy smile, and the number 400 stitched onto his uniform lapel. The school's polite way of saying dead last. Dio introduced himself in the corridor, and did not stop introducing himself for the next 20 minutes. He knew the name of every professor. He knew the name of every noble in every class. He knew which teachers took bribes and which ones took payments and favors. He wanted to know why on earth a boy who had scored a perfect entrance had willingly moved in with the school's problem. Rude gave the master's cover answer. He was sick. He needed a quiet roommate. Dio raised an eyebrow at the word quiet and let it go. Dio was the one who explained the school's caste. 3 tiers. Adun at the bottom, where all first years began, where Rude and Letisis and Dio all lived. Clad in the middle, older students who ran discipline for the professors. Hirus at the top, the elite 5%, roughly 20 students out of 400, with sweeping privileges and their own quarters. Promotion happened once a year, by tournament and exam. The current Harris leader by influence, if not by rank, was a boy named Chevelle von Hidalio. Beautiful, rich, powerful. And, Dio added with a shrug, the person who had made Letisis a target since day one. Rude asked why. Dio's easy smile flickered once, and vanished. He said it was a family thing. He said there had been an incident when they were children, a library, a dead girl. He said no one who wasn't there knew what had really happened, but everyone at the school had decided on their own version. In that version, Letisis had turned into something not human and killed a small child. In that version, he had been let back into society only because his mother was powerful. Every student in Adun had been raised on that story before they arrived, so by the time they got here, they already knew whose face to avoid at breakfast. Rude thought about this. He walked with Dio out to the central courtyard. Afternoon sun was bright. Students in uniform crossed the grass in small groups. And in the middle of the yard, in the open, 3 older students had cornered a small dark-haired figure by the fountain and were taking turns pushing him against the stone. The dark-haired figure was Letisis. Rude stopped walking. Dio touched his sleeve and told him softly not to get involved. Dio said the last student who had stepped in for Letisis had ended up in the infirmary for a week. The professors did not care. The bullies were Harris. The Duchess's name did not carry inside these walls. Dio said kindly that Rude was a 7th-class rookie in a school that ate 7th-class rookies. He said the smart thing to do was walk away. Rude looked at him for one long moment. Then he set his book bag down on the grass. He crossed the courtyard toward the fountain, alone. The 3 older boys were laughing when he arrived. One of them turned to see him coming and started to say something clever. He did not finish the word. Rude was small. That was always the first thing people noticed, and the last thing they checked twice. He hit the first boy with a palm to the sternum. Not a mage's strike, not mana, just weight and angle and the kind of mechanical precision that looks simple after 10 years of training and looks like luck when you're on the receiving end. The boy sat down hard on the fountain's edge and slid off the back of it into the water. His friends turned. The second one swung wide. Rude stepped into it, took the swing on his shoulder, and drove one elbow up under the third boy's chin. Clean, fast. The boy's eyes glazed and he folded. The second one, the one who had swung, pulled back and stared at Rude. A long, still moment passed. He ran. The fountain water dripped. Rude turned around. Letisis had not moved from the spot. He stood with his back against the stone and his arms at his sides, watching Rude with those flat, dark eyes. He was not grateful. He did not look relieved. He looked, more than anything, worried. He told Rude, in a low voice, that getting involved with him was a mistake. He said every person who had tried to help him ended up regretting it. He said this matter-of-factly, without self-pity, the way someone says the stove is hot, after they have checked too many times. He told Rude to ask for a new room before morning. He pushed off the fountain and walked back across the grass toward the dormitory, without once looking at his hands. Rude watched him go. Dio appeared at his shoulder again, having crossed the courtyard at some point during the fight without Rude noticing. Dio looked at the boy floating in the fountain. He looked at Rude. He said, with great solemnity, that he had seen 3 clad-tier students laid out faster by Rude than by most people he knew, and that this was the most interesting thing that had happened all semester. Rude picked up his book bag and said nothing. Dio explained the politics over dinner, in a mess hall full of students who kept glancing at Rude and then looking away again. He used the pepper grinder as a stand-in for House Hydelio and a bread roll as House Arshan. The feud was old, older than any of the students at this school, built on land rights and old wars and a grudge about a river border that had calcified over 3 generations into something neither house could let go of without losing face. Letisis was the second son of the Duchess. Chevelle was the heir of the Marquis. In a different world, with different families, they might have been raised as rivals and nothing worse. But then came the library incident. Dio put down the pepper grinder. He said he only knew what had been told, that 8 years ago, during a joint family visit, Letisis and the 2 Hydelio children had slipped away from the adults and into a private library. Iril, the younger Hydelio daughter, had been friends with Letisis, by all accounts genuinely fond of him in the way small children are fond of soft and quiet things. Something happened in that library. Something killed Iril. By the time adults found them, the little girl was dead, and Letisis was the only other child in the room. The older boy, Chevelle, had apparently not been there when it happened. He'd gone ahead down another hall. He came back after. The family's story, and the story that spread, was that Letisis had transformed. That the blood in him was not right, that he was not entirely human, that he had killed the girl in a state of some monstrous change. The truth, Dio said, was that no one had been charged. No mage investigation was ever completed. The Duchess had taken her son away and gone silent. The Hydelio family had never spoken to the Arshans again. And the story that hardened in the years between had taken Letisis from a curious, quiet child to a thing the Empire's nobility told their children to be frightened of. Rude ate his food and let Dio talk. What he was thinking about was the dark mana he had felt the moment he touched his new roommate's shoulder in the doorway. He had not reached for Letisis, not deliberately. Their sleeves had brushed when Letisis stepped back to let him in. For a fraction of a second, Rude's own mana had stirred, the way it always stirred when it sensed something related, like calling to like. He was not sure what Letisis was. He was sure it was not what the story said. He was also sure that if there was something running in Letisis's blood, the wrong person was going to find it before he did. 3 days passed. Rude watched. He attended lectures and sat in the middle of the class, not the front and not the back. He answered questions at a level just below his actual capability. Good enough to look clever, poor enough to go unremarked. He moved through the dormitory at the pace of a boy who slept too much and ate too little, which was exactly the presentation the master had prepared for him. Students left him alone. The name Blow had not surfaced once. He thought perhaps the school would be manageable. On the 4th day, Chevelle von Hydelio walked down their corridor. He was tall and bright-looking, with the kind of face that worked rooms without effort. Gold hair, clean jaw, a smile he did not direct at everyone. Behind him came 2 or 3 people whose purpose was to confirm that anything Chevelle did was the right thing to do. He stopped in the hall outside Rude and Letisis's door. He looked at Letisis first, long and cold. Then his eyes moved to Rude with the patient curiosity of someone examining something they have not decided how to dispose of yet. He told Rude, in a perfectly pleasant voice, that Rude had been in a room with the abomination for 4 days now. He said it the way one mentions an oversight in someone's paperwork. He said he wanted to give Rude a fair chance to move before it became a problem. Rude told him he liked his room. Chevelle's smile did not change. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small flat stone. Rommel, a catalyst for mental interference magic. He held it in 2 fingers without activating it, just held it, the way a person holds a pen while considering whether to sign something. He said, very softly, that Letisis had a way of making people understand what he was. He said it was best to get that understanding early. Letisis had gone still beside Rude. His jaw was tight. His arms pressed to his sides the way they always did when he was working hard to take up less space. Chevelle closed his hand around the Rommel stone and cast. The magic came in silence, which was the worst kind. No light, no flash, no build-up. One moment Letisis was standing in the corridor, and the next moment he was somewhere else entirely, in his own head, in a memory that wore the shape of a library. He dropped to his knees. His breath came in short, hard pulls. His hands went flat to the floor tiles, bracing against something the corridor itself couldn't offer. His eyes were open but not looking at anything. He was in the library. He was always in the library. He had lived in it for 8 years without leaving, in the way that bad memories live somewhere behind your throat and open up without permission. The little girl with the flower. The one who had looked at him like he was just a person, which nobody his age had done before or since. Then the demon. Then the screaming. Then the weight of two small hands and one voice saying it again. Monster. Rude caught Letisis before he hit the floor. He said nothing to Letisis. He looked up at Chevelle with the empty expression he kept on the surface of his face, the way other people kept a coin on their windowsill. Always there, always the same side up. He asked, in the mildest possible voice, whether that had been a mental interference cast. He said his head felt strange. He was pretending the mana had clipped him too. He pressed one hand to his temple and made his eyes go slightly unfocused. He did this very well. Chevelle looked at him with new interest. A door opened at the end of the hall. Professor Hale stepped through it. He was a composed man, mid-30s, dressed in a light jacket with soft colors. He had the kind of face that put people at ease immediately, and the kind of smile that looked assembled rather than felt. He taught teleportation theory, and was considered one of the more approachable members of faculty. He looked at Chevelle, then at the two Edun students on the floor. He clicked his tongue, which was the expression adults at this school used instead of doing something. He told Chevelle that personal magic in the corridors was against the code of conduct. Chevelle apologized pleasantly and walked away. Professor Hale crouched beside Letisis and asked if he needed the infirmary. Letisis said no. Hale said all right and stood up and walked away. He paused once at the corner and looked back at Rude. Rude was still rubbing his temple. Hale watched him for one extra second before he turned and went. Letisis sat against the wall and did not speak for a while. Rude sat with him. Students passed them without stopping. Eventually, Letisis said quietly that he had told Rude to move rooms. Rude said he had heard him. Letisis pulled his knees up and rested his arms on them and stared at the far wall. He said that the memory did not get smaller. He said sometimes he thought it had grown since childhood, taken up more space, not less. He was not speaking to Rude exactly. He was speaking to the wall, and Rude was simply close enough to hear. Rude told him he would get better at fighting it. He said it the way someone says a practical thing. Not warm, not cold, but level. Letisis looked at him sideways. He did not thank him. After a moment he got up and went back into the room. Rude sat in the corridor alone for another minute, thinking about a man with a satisfied look who had paused too long at a corner. Hale had not been surprised to find them there. He had not come from the direction of the staff room. The corridor was a dead end. He had opened that door from a room he had no reason to be in, at the exact moment the cast landed. Rude filed it away. The next week at Helios passed under a kind of cold pressure that was easy to miss if you were not looking for it. Rude was looking for it. He watched the small systems the school ran on. The way Edun students moved around Letisis in the hallways, not dramatically, just instinctively. The way water moves around a stone that's been in the river long enough. The way clad-tier monitors looked past Letisis in the refectory, as if he were furniture. The way professors took attendance and paused the breath of a half-second at his name, and he answered and the pause closed and nothing ever followed. A whole institution arranged around a boy without ever meeting his eyes. Eel Florenfrome noticed Rude noticing. Eel was different in the way that a few students at schools like this were always different. She had more talent than the surroundings required, and enough self-possession not to spend it on other people's approval. Her hair was bright. Her mana was sharp and clean when she used it in practical class. Not showy, but precise. The kind of control that came from long, quiet work. She was the first Hera student whose name Rude learned, and she had learned his first. She sat across from him in morning seminar 3 days into the second week, and watched him answer a question at 3/4 of his capability. She said nothing. She watched him do it again the following day. On the third day, after the seminar cleared, she stayed in her seat until the room was empty and looked at him and asked if he always performed so deliberately beneath himself. Rude said he was sickly. She said she had seen how he walked. She said sick people did not move like that. He said some did. She looked at him for a long moment and seemed to decide that the conversation had reached its natural end. She stood and picked up her notes. On her way to the door she paused and said, as if it were incidental, that she had noticed the same pattern of careful hiding in Letisis, and that she thought most of the class mistook it for guilt. She left. Rude sat alone in the empty seminar room and thought about her. 2 days later she walked up to Letisis at his table in the refectory, where he always ate alone, and sat down across from him. Students at neighboring tables watched with the tight-faced attention of people who have decided not to be responsible for what happens next. Eel put her tray down, opened her textbook, and started eating. Letticis watched her with the expression of someone waiting for the catch. It did not come. She ate and read and said nothing. When she finished, she stood, closed her book, and left without ceremony. The next day she did it again. Letticis still waited for the catch. He stopped waiting at the end of the week, which was the same day Eel, in the middle of the refectory, extended her hand to him across the table. Not a dramatic gesture, not a speech, just her hand, held out, palm up. Letticis looked at it. The table next to them had gone very quiet. He took it, briefly, and she nodded and went back to her food. On the far side of the refectory, a Heiress boy reported back to Cheval that Eel Florenchrome had touched the Arshan abomination of her own volition. Cheval listened without reacting and said nothing for a long time after. Rude noted it all and made no move. What he was watching was the pressure building from the opposite direction. The Clad-tier students had a ringleader for their arm of the Letticis campaign. His name was Manon. Not Heiress, not brilliant, not the one who gave orders at the top. He was the middle manager of a school's cruelty, the sort of person who does not originate the malice, but is essential to its delivery. He ran a group of a dozen Clad students who functioned as unofficial monitors for the Edun corridor. When a freshman said the wrong thing or shook the wrong hand, Manon wrote it down. His notebook had been full of names since the first week of term. Rude had seen Manon's notebook. He had seen it from across a courtyard, at a distance that should not have let him read it. He had very good eyes. His own name was in there. Third page, third line down. New 7th class Edun. Chose Arshan room. He was running out of time to stay invisible. The boiling point came on a Tuesday. Rude was in the eastern dormitory corridor when he heard it start. Not a crash, not a shout. Just the sound of a very large number of students moving together, which has its own quality of silence inside it, a held breath that a whole crowd makes at once. He turned the corner and found every Edun class student in the year being herded by Clad monitors through the double doors of the East Grand Lecture Hall. The monitors stood at intervals of 5 meters with their arms crossed. Nobody was running. Everyone was walking very carefully, like people who know the ground is loose underfoot. Rude walked in with the others. The lecture hall was shaped like an amphitheater, seats rising in arcs from a central floor. At the front of the floor stood a reinforced practice target, a thick panel of dark wood braced on a steel frame, the kind that absorbed first-class attacks at close range without splitting. Attached to the target by metal cuffs around his wrists was Letticis. His head was down. His shoulders were rigid with the effort of not pulling at the chains. Manon stood to one side with his notebook. He looked satisfied, which was the most specific kind of ugly Rude had seen all week. Manon announced to the assembled class that this was an optional practical exercise. Each student would select one mana orb from the cart by the door and throw it at the marked target. He paused to let that settle. He added that any student who deliberately missed would be noted in his record and could expect disciplinary review. He said this last part while looking at a girl in the second row who was already crying. She was the first one called. She walked to the cart with her hands shaking, picked up a small blue orb, and stood in the marked throwing position. She threw it left, wide, nowhere near the target. Manon wrote her name down. He read it back to the room once, for the room's benefit. Rude counted the students ahead of him. 23. He thought about how many bones he could break and what cover he would have if he broke them all at once. He thought about the Duchess, and the contract, and the instruction to stay invisible. He thought about the sound of Letticis's wrists settling against the metal cuffs when they were first latched. A boy threw an orb and it struck Letticis in the shoulder. A girl after him struck his arm. A third student landed one between his shoulder blades and walked back to his seat with a set jaw that said, "I am not looking. I am not looking. I am not here." Rude raised his hand. The room went quiet in a way that had texture to it. Manon looked at him with the particular smile of someone who is pleased that a small problem has presented itself. He told Rude to go ahead. Rude stood up from his seat and walked down to the cart. He took his time. He picked up an orb and turned it over once in his palm, examining it the way he might examine a piece of fruit at a market stall. He looked at the reinforced practice target, the target that was built to stop first-class hits, that had sat unmarked through 32 students' throws. He looked at Letticis once, quickly. Leticius's jaw was tight. His eyes were on the floor. Rude turned back to the target. He drew back his arm and threw. There was no bang, no crack. The board simply ended. Where it had been a moment before was gray dust raining onto the floor, and Leticius's wrists settling into open air where the cuffs had been split clean off their frame. The metal pieces rang on the tiles like dropped coins. The steel frame stood empty. The dust was still falling when the silence hit the room like a dropped ceiling. Rude picked up a second orb from the cart. He turned it over in his palm again, the same motion as before. His face carried no expression. He said softly that his hand must have slipped. He asked Manon, with great politeness, whether Manon would mind stepping to the target marker. He said it the way someone suggests a minor administrative correction. He said Manon looked like he needed the practice. The silence lasted 2 more seconds. Manon moved first. He dropped his notebook and threw his hand up, and 3 clad monitors rushed for Rude from different angles at once. Someone in the seats screamed. Chairs scraped. Rude put the second orb in his jacket pocket, shifted his weight back, and began. He did not use mana, not a trace, not a flicker. He fought them with his hands and his feet, and the kind of economy that came from knowing exactly how much force a body needed and giving it precisely that much. The first monitor went sideways into a row of seats with 1 push. The second took a forearm to the throat and sat down wheezing. The third swung, and Rude stepped under it and put him on the floor with a trip at the knee. The next 2 came together and went together. A 6th had his arm turned at the elbow, and a 7th tripped on the 6th before he could swing. By the time the wave of clad monitors had exhausted itself, Rude was standing in the same spot on the floor, breathing at the same pace as before. Manon was at the back of the hall with the target frame between them, and the frame had no target anymore. Leticius had not moved. He stood with his freed wrists hanging at his sides, and his eyes on Rude, with an expression Rude had not seen on his face before. Not gratitude, not fear. Something more complicated. Something closer to the moment before a person decides to believe something they had stopped letting themselves believe. From the 3rd row, a girl, not the one who had cried, a different girl, stood up and started talking. Her voice shook, but she did not stop. She said they all knew what they had done. She said the crying girl had missed on purpose, and they had all seen that, and not one of them had said a word in her defense. She said they had sat in those seats and watched and told themselves it was not their fault because they had not thrown the first one. She said she was not brave, she was not pretending to be, but she was done telling herself silence was the same as not choosing. The girl was Ren. She had been sitting in the Edun class the whole time. She was a guest faculty observer from Ophion's associate program, seated among the students, and not once since the hall had filled had she made herself known. And now she crossed the floor and stood beside Leticius and did not touch him, and did not make a show of it. The lecture hall doors opened. Professor Raoul walked in. She was long-limbed with deep purple hair and the kind of stillness that had nothing to do with being calm. Her mana was first class. Every person in the room felt it arrive before they saw her. She looked at the dust on the floor where the target had been. She looked at Manon pressed against the back wall. She looked at the line of clad monitors sitting among the seats with various degrees of damage. She looked at Rude. She walked to him. She stopped 4 steps away. She raised one hand to her side, and a small mana orb appeared in her palm, orange-tipped, warm. She threw it at Rude without preamble, without announcement, at a speed that should have connected clean. It did not connect. He shifted his weight, and it passed him by a margin of 3 inches, close enough to pull at his hair. The orb buried itself in the back wall, where it left a scorch mark the size of a dinner plate. Raoul looked at the scorch mark. She looked at Rude. She said, in a voice that filled the room without being raised, that she found the result of this practical exercise very interesting. She asked him, in front of every Idun student, what his mage class was. Rude pressed one hand to his forehead and said his head was spinning. He said the earlier excitement had brought on his condition. He said he had a note from his physician. He did this very badly, which was the whole point. Performed incompetence is a skill, and it only worked if the audience was confident enough in their own reading to believe the performance. He watched Raoul's eyes. She was not confident, she was not fooled, but she could not prove it in a room full of students without making a scene she had not prepared, and a professor of her caliber did not make unprepared scenes. She told the room the exercise was over. She told the Edun students to go back to their dormitories. She held Rude's gaze for 3 full seconds before she turned away. Her last line, delivered to the air, was that she expected that 7th-class students who scraped perfect scores would come to her office the following morning to explain their technique. Rude said he would look forward to it. He did not mean that. He found Letticis in the corridor an hour later, sitting on the stone step outside the dormitory door, watching the sky go dark over the courtyard. Rude sat next to him. They did not speak. After a while, Letticis said, without looking at him, that he had asked Rude to move rooms. Rude said he was aware. Letticis said that what had happened in the lecture hall would make things worse, not better. Rude said possibly. Letticis said he meant what he had told Rude on the first day, that the people near him ended up paying a price for it. Rude said he had heard him. Letticis said Rude was not listening. Rude said that was not the same as not hearing. Letticis stared at him. Rude looked at the sky. The conversation finished. That night, after midnight, Rude lay in the dark on his dormitory bed and stared at the ceiling with the stillness of a person who was not sleeping and had not tried. The room was quiet. Letticis breathed slowly on the far side of it. The window was cracked 2 inches at the top, and cool air moved through the gap. Rude felt the mana before he saw anything. It arrived like a pressure change, the way deep water feels when something large moves through it nearby. He turned his head. The window was still cracked 2 inches. The dark beyond it had a shape in it now. The shape was tall, hooded, standing in the courtyard with its face toward the glass. A faint blue light came from where its eyes would have been. Rude sat up. The figure lifted one hand and passed straight through the glass as if the glass were not there. The wall swallowed it without sound, and it stood inside the room, at the foot of Letticis's bed, looking down. It had the body of a man and nothing else. No heartbeat that Rude could feel. No anchor of living mana. Something was operating it from outside the room, possibly from outside the building. Rude moved in one motion from the bed to the figure. He closed his hand around its wrist. The hood fell back. For 1 second, before the face dissolved into dark energy, it was a face he recognized. Not from here, from somewhere older, somewhere that the cover of Rude Krishi did not reach. He had seen that face across a different kind of room. The figure came apart in his hand, the dark energy scattered and vanished. The room returned to quiet. Letticis had not woken. The window still breathed cold air through its 2-inch gap, and outside, the courtyard was empty. But before the last trace of it went, he heard, or felt, or found somewhere in the dissolving mana the impression of 2 words. It is coming soon. The meeting with Raoul the following morning lasted 40 minutes, during which she asked Rude 8 different versions of the same question, and he gave 8 different versions of the same non-answer. She sat across from him with her hands flat on her desk and her purple hair over one shoulder, and at the end she told him, pleasantly, that she was not done with him. He told her he understood and left. In the hall outside her office, he let out a breath and kept walking. 2 days later, Professor Hale announced field training. The announcement came in Rude's morning practical, delivered with Hale's usual composed warmth. He said the Edun year would spend 3 days in the Magic Tower's external training facility, a controlled dimensional room maintained specifically for academy combat exercises. He said it would involve terrain mapping, monster combat, and group survival assessment. He said mana reserves should be full and belongings light. He said this in the gentle voice of a man who cared very much about his students' development. Several students wrote down the details with the focused attention of people who believed him. That evening, Rude caught a piece of the conversation Hale had with Chevelle in the East Corridor. He was not close enough to hear words. He was close enough to read the shape of it. Hale leaned in. Chevelle listened. Chevelle nodded once with a tight jaw. Then Hale walked away, and Chevelle turned and said something short to the 2 Harris students behind him. They had the look of people who had just been included in something. Rude did not like the look of it. He tried to reach his master that night through the small communication crystal the Duchess had supplied. The connection held for 30 seconds and then broke. He tried again. It held for 10. The third attempt returned nothing but a low hum. The dormitory walls were old stone, thick and dense, and the school sat in a fold of hills that made long-range crystal signals unreliable. He put the crystal away and stared at the ceiling for a while. The morning of field training was bright and cold. The whole Edun year assembled in the ground floor practice hall. 80-odd students in rows. with Hale at the front beside a large mana-powered transit circle already drawn into the stone floor. It was a proper construction, layered lines, multiple theory intersections, the kind of work that took hours to prepare. Hale ran through safety procedures. He explained that the tower's training room would activate a small weather system and scatter groups for the first segment of the exercise. He told them not to panic if they landed separated. Rude stood near the back of the group and watched Hale's hands. Hale's hands were at his sides, easy and loose. His voice was calm. His eyes moved across the assembled students with the systematic patience of someone counting. On the second-floor walkway above the hall, Raoul appeared at the railing, arms folded, watching. 3 or 4 Harris students she had clearly arranged to attend came down the stairs and joined the edge of the group. Chevelle was among them. Hale made a small gesture. The transit circle activated. 80 students stepped forward together, and the hall filled with the white-blue light of a transfer in motion. From the balcony, Hale looked down. His composed face held for exactly 1 second past when it should have. Then something behind it moved. He reached into his jacket and drew out a second stone. This one was not part of any transit preparation. He set it against the circle's outer ring and pressed it in. The white-blue light went wrong. It darkened at the edges first, then ran inward, and the stone floor of the circle swallowed a deep and liquid black. A sound came up from the circle that had no name for it. Not a groan, not a crack. Something between and below both. Raoul moved the moment she heard it. Her hand went up, and a spear of ice the height of a man launched off her palm and destroyed the large mana crystal mounted on the hall's back wall in one hit. She had seen the crystal as the power source and gone straight for it. She was right, and she was also wrong. The crystal powered the transit. The dark liquid was something else, something that had been growing in the circle's seams since Hale set the stone against them. Destroying the crystal stopped the transit. It did not stop what was already rising. The black tide came up through the floor tiles, and the 80 students in the circle had nowhere to go and nothing to grab. Rude felt the pull start at his feet. He looked for Letisis, found him 4 rows forward, and was already moving. He did not reach him. The pull became absolute. The floor opened and swallowed the room. Ishwela. The sky was red, not sunset red, not weather red. The red of old iron left in rain, dark and flat, with no sun visible anywhere in it. The ground was black rock, cracked in long seams, and from the deepest cracks ran something that looked like water but moved too slowly for water. It was dark mana. Rivers of it, slow and cold, flowing nowhere in particular, following the pulls of a landscape that had been sealed away from the living world for long enough to forget it. Students appeared across a half-mile of broken terrain, alone and in pairs, stumbling upright on rocks they did not know. Voices called out from various distances and were swallowed by the silence of a place with no echoes. Rude landed in a canyon. The walls were 3 times his height on both sides, dark rock with the texture of old charcoal, and the canyon floor was narrow and littered with debris from whatever had collapsed it. He was alone. He held still and let his mana reach out in every direction without showing. A slow, quiet spread, like a hand pressing lightly against a surface to feel for what was behind it. What he felt first was Letisis, at distance and in the wrong direction. What he felt second was Lapis, the small blonde duke's son from the auction, whose presence at Helios had been explained to Rude by the master as a post-auction enrollment, the boy's father deciding his son needed structured training after watching his escort get blown up in a hall. What he felt in the canyon next to Lapis was something with teeth. He ran. The red wolves were the color of dried blood and silent on their feet. 3 of them had Lapis pinned against a canyon wall, and 2 more were circling back toward a purple-haired Harris student Rude registered as Lioness, who had apparently chosen to throw mana orbs at them from a crouch, which was not working. A girl, Cynthia, was on a shelf of rock above, paralyzed and silent. The wolves moved in perfect synchrony, which was not how animals moved. Rude arrived between Lapis and the nearest wolf without slowing. His hand came down once, and the wolf went still and hit the rock floor with nothing left in its body that had been there a moment before. The others turned toward him. He was already moving. Dark haze bled from his fingers in controlled threads. Not the full pour, not even close. Just the precise amount to end 5 specific things quickly and quietly, without cracking the canyon walls. It took 12 seconds. The pack dissolved. The canyon was quiet again. Lapis recognized him after a moment of staring. His face went through several changes in rapid succession. The last one was a huge, trembling-lipped expression that Rude classified as someone working very hard not to make a noise. He told Lapis to hold on together. He crouched and pulled out the communication crystal. This time it connected for 20 seconds. Enough. His master's voice came through thin and wrong with interference, but the words arrived. The master said the name Ishwela and stopped making the joking voice entirely. He said the tower's seal over the land was still active, which meant no one had expected anyone to be inside it. He said the dimensional walls were thick and Rude should not count on a rescue before the tower noticed the anomaly and acted. He said the monsters in Ishwela should not exist there, and if they did, something had fed them entry. He said something else that was cut off by static. The connection died on his last word. Rude put the crystal away. He told Lapis, Lioness, and Cynthia to stay behind him and not step near the dark mana rivers. They moved through the canyon. The next 3 hours were a running assessment of what Hale had done and what it would take to undo it. Rude found the answer to the second question eventually, in the form of a distant pillar of light rising from somewhere beyond a ridge of black rock. Light in Ishwela was wrong. What produced light here would be a mass of active mana, the kind a ritual created. Whatever Hale was building, it was already running. They were climbing toward the ridge when the dragon worm came up through the rock. It was long and pale, with a flat, wide head and a mouth that opened too far, and it came from directly below, splitting the rock of the canyon path in a spray of debris that knocked Lioness off his feet. Rude had Lapis in his arms and moving in the half-second before the mouth cleared the rock. The worm swung toward him. Its mana was dense and blunt, the kind of power that worked by mass rather than precision. A lance of ice took it through the right jaw from behind. Raoul dropped from the canyon rim, landed on both feet without bending, and put a second lance through the worm's body at mid-length. It sagged sideways into the rock and went still. She did not breathe hard. Her hair was loose, one clasp lost somewhere in the fall. She looked at Rude across the width of the canyon, and he looked back at her, and a great deal passed between them without being said. She told him they needed to reach the other students. She said she had seen Hale's direction before she fell, and she was going the same direction Rude was. She said, without warmth or accusation, that she supposed they were going the same way. Rude said he supposed so. They moved together. It was not comfortable. She watched him from the corner of her eye every few minutes, and he felt her watching, and neither of them addressed it. Lapis and Lioness walked behind them in reverent silence, as if they were being escorted by forces of nature, and were trying to make themselves small enough to avoid attention. Over the ridge, at a distance, the pillar of light was brighter. At its base, a chunk of cliff had lifted free of the ground, whole and intact, and rose slowly into the red sky. Then Rude felt the presence in front of him. Shikmuan came over the ridge crest from the opposite direction, alone, walking at a pace that said he had been tracking something since the moment he landed. His red hair was unwound from its usual tie and fell around his face. He had no expression that Rude could name. He stopped 10 paces from Rude and they stood on the ridge of a sealed, cursed land with a floating island rising behind them and looked at each other. Shikmuan said, very quietly, that he had known. He said the goosebumps had started when Rude walked into his range at the auction hall and had not gone away. He said he had been waiting for the right moment to confirm it, and he had followed the field trip down here on purpose, using Hale's circle as a vehicle, because opportunity looked different every time and you had to be ready to take it in whatever shape it arrived. Rude said, very quietly, that now was not the time. He said people were going to die on that floating island if no one got there. He said this in the same register as telling someone the road ahead had a dropped tree across it. Useful information, not a threat, not a performance. Shikmuan said he did not care about the floating island. He said he cared about the feeling. He let his mana out, not at target destruction level, but enough. Heat came off his palms. Raoul stepped to the side. She did not intervene. She watched Rude. Up on the floating island, Hale dropped the last piece of his costume. He stood at the island's center and looked down at the class below him with the expression of a man who had been wearing a tight collar for months and had finally cut it off. He said, loud enough to carry across the open air between the risen rock and the ground, that the exercise was unfortunately going to run long. He said he was sorry for the students who had expected to go home on Thursday. He said this in the exact voice he used for seminar announcements, and the normalcy of it made it worse. Dio said something from behind him, something with an edge in it, not frightened, challenging. Hale turned to look at him. His hand came up and something dark and shaped reached out from it and wrapped around Dio's throat. Not a mana grab, darker. The kind of grip that took the air as well as the body. He held Dio off the ground for 2 seconds. Then he let go. Dio fell. Not to the island. Off the island's edge. Into the gap between the risen rock and the ground below. Several students screamed. The sound stretched out wrong in Ishwela's flat air. Hale watched the drop with mild interest. He said Dio had been noisy. He turned back to the assembled students, as if he had set down a cup that had been bothering him. What came next was the mask that had lived under the composed mask. He told the class they were here because he had needed an audience for a ritual, and an audience of mages worked better than an audience of livestock. He said he had no interest in their grades or their parents' names. He said one of them had something he needed, and the rest were leverage. He looked at Letisis. Letisis looked back at him. Hale raised both arms. The rock under the island cracked and separated, and 4 massive boulders the size of houses rose above the class at the island's corners. He told Letisis to surrender whatever was inside him. He told him that if he did not, the boulders would come down on his classmates. He told him, with the patience of someone explaining a timetable, that this was simple mathematics, and Letisis was a sensible person. Cheval was already standing at the island's edge. He had been there since Hale spoke, standing very still, and Rude, watching from below, understood in 2 seconds what nobody on the island seemed to have understood yet. Cheval's eyes were wrong. Not frightened, not angry, absent. Something behind them had been switched off. Hale had prepared Cheval as a weapon before the field trip, and Cheval had not known it, and the control had activated here. Hale pointed at the class and told Cheval to remind them of the stakes. Cheval turned to face his classmates and raised his hand. The illusion that came off it was not subtle. It hit the whole island at once. A memory that was not anyone's specific memory, but had the texture of one. Cold, dark, the sound of a girl screaming, a library turning the wrong shape. Students fell back from it. Some grabbed each other. Letisis did not react, because he had lived in the real version of it for so long that the illusion found nothing new to use against him. Then Cheval's own control cracked. It was his sister's scream. Inside the illusion Hale had armed him with was a sound Cheval had not chosen to include, a specific note that had not come from Hale's design but from Cheval's own memory of that night, which had forced itself into the working. He heard it, and the weapon turned in his hand. The construct broke. His eyes came back. He was standing at the island's edge. The ground was far below. He looked around at the ring of terrified students and the 4 hanging boulders, and Hale watching him with the mild irritation of someone whose tool had malfunctioned, and Cheval understood where he was and what he was standing in. Letisis was at the edge 2 meters from him. He had moved there, in the moment the illusion broke, with his hand out, because Cheval was too close to the drop. They looked at each other. Everything that needed to be said about the library, about the 8 years, about the girl with the flower, none of it could be said here, in this place, with boulders above them, and the wrong sky overhead, and the sound of Hale beginning to move again. Cheval looked at Letisis's outstretched hand. He looked at it the way a person looks at something they broke a long time ago, and had stopped expecting to ever be offered again. He took hold of it, and then he let go. Not a fall, a choice. He said, while he still had Letisis's fingers, that it was not Letisis's fault. He said the words directly, without softening them or surrounding them with anything. He said he had said something to Letisis a long time ago and it was a lie, and the person who had given him the lie had known it was a lie. He said Letisis was an idiot for protecting him, specifically, out of everyone in the class. He said this last part as something close to affection. Then he let go of the hand and stepped back off the edge, so that Letisis would not have to choose between the hand and the class, and fell. The boulders came down. Rude arrived through the underside of the island. He came up through the rock floor of the island in a shape that was not the shape he wore at school. Taller, dark coat, black haze running from both hands in slow, deliberate streams. He caught Cheval with one arm on the way up, without looking, a precise grab by feel and mana sense, mid-air, clean, and cleared the island's floor an instant later. He landed with Chevelle laid out safely to one side, straightened up, and looked at the boulders. He put one hand out and the dark haze went up like a wall. The boulders hit it and came apart. Not shattered, dissolved at the contact point, the mana inside them eaten clean by the haze before the stone could move another inch. The dust of 4 house-sized rocks drifted down over the island in a long, slow fall, and the sky behind was a flat, terrible red. Minos stood at the island's center and looked at the man standing in the dust of what he had built. Rude looked back. Minos had finished his transformation. The thing that had been hail wore 4 wings of black stone and fire, and his face had changed the way faces change when someone has stopped caring what they look like in the morning. He was taller. His hands ended in shapes that were not hands anymore. He had wanted to be beyond human, and he had made it at the cost of every human thing that had made him readable. He looked at Rude and said the name. Blow. Not as a challenge, as an identification, the way a person confirms they recognize a face in a crowd. He said the Black Mage of Ophion was here. He said something that passed for admiring, if admiration lived in a very cold place. Then he reached for the nearest student and used them as a shield. Rude said, flat and unhurried, that he should put the student down. Minos smiled at him with the new face and said that Class 1 dark mages were famous for knowing when a hostage was real. He said he wanted Letisis delivered to him and he would release everyone else. He said it conversationally, as if they were negotiating a catering arrangement. Rude looked at the student. He looked at Minos. He pushed forward. It was not a fight that looked the way fights in the school's practice hall looked. No circles, no theory combinations, no measured exchanges. Minos released the student and swung a pillar of fire and rock that carved a trench through the island's floor from left to right. Rude stepped over the trench. The haze from his right hand ate the next attack before it formed, pulling the mana out of the working while it was still assembling. Minos retreated 4 steps and tried a larger cast, pulling the island's stone itself into a wall of moving rock. The haze went into the wall's foundation, and the wall dropped in sections. Minos tried one more time, pulling everything he had into a single point, white and orange at the center, something close to a true fusion cast, the kind of thing that ended battlefields. The haze ate it. It ate it from the outside in, the same way it had eaten 3 monsters in a concert hall, the same way it had been eating things for the length of its master's adult life. The cast dissolved into dark smoke and silence, and the smoke rose into the red sky and was gone. Rude stood over Minos. The 4 wings had stopped moving. The island's floor was a crater around them. Rude put 1 foot down on Minos's chest, not hard, just present. The foot of a person who is done. Minos tried to reach up and found he could not move anything below his wings. Something was wrong with his blood. Rude saw it when the wings shifted. Not red, not the brown red of a mage's blood under a skin. Blue. A bright and glowing blue that had nothing in it of anything that had been born the usual way. He looked at Minos and asked, quietly, who had given him the power. He asked which name was behind the ritual. He said if Minos answered, he would make this fast. Minos looked up at him. His expression had come back. Not the composed professor face, not the 4-winged demon face. Just a man at the end of something, calculating. He opened his mouth. A sound came from above. Not wind, not the island settling. Something large landing on the island's highest point, which had not been the highest point a moment ago because something very large was now on it. The dragon was blue. Not the blue of water, the blue of a gem held in front of a cold light, faceted and deep and absolutely without warmth. It was the size of a building. It had set itself down on the island's rim with a delicacy that was more alarming than if it had crashed, because anything that large moving that quietly was in complete control of itself. It looked at Rude. Its head turned slowly, the way a large animal turns to examine something interesting that has appeared in its territory. It looked at Minos. It lifted 1 massive foot off the rim and stepped down to them. Minos looked at the dragon. His blue blood had reached his hands now, spreading from the wings to the fingers. He looked at Rude and his calculation finished. He said 1 word, half-shaped, the beginning of a name. The dragon ate him. Not a battle, not a struggle. 1 movement, decisive and total, and Minos was gone, and what the dragon had swallowed was still and silent inside it. It lifted its head. It looked at Rude with those cold gem eyes and sniffed once, a slow, deep pull of air that moved Rude's coat. Then it stepped back to the rim and off the edge of the island, and fell, and when it hit the ground it was not a dragon anymore, and there was no one there. Rude stood in the crater of the island and looked at the place where Minus had been. His only lead. Gone. He had been 3 syllables from a name. Below, the Magic Tower's rescue portal cracked open in a seam of silver light above the ground. Figures came through it, tower mages, and among them a man Rude half recognized as Marquis Hidelio, Chevelle's father, who moved with the deliberate economy of a Class 1 mage who had been told to solve a problem and intended to solve it quickly. He cast something that extended across the island's edges, and the students on the rim felt it catch them, a weightlessness at the shoulders, like hands lifting them gently. The island began to lower. Every student descended at the rate of a leaf, guided by mana threads from below. Rude reached Chevelle. Chevelle was sitting up, which was more than he had expected. He looked at Rude and then looked away and then looked back. He said, with difficulty, that he had seen enough to know. Rude told him, in the calm voice, what the story would be when they got back. He said Chevelle had been frightened and had slipped. He said that was the full account and it ended there. He said, did Chevelle understand? Chevelle looked at him for a long moment, with the expression of someone who is trying to find the argument and has run out of the energy to assemble it. He said he understood. Rude let him stand on his own. He stepped back and let his coat sit flat around a shorter, younger blonde frame, and by the time the island was level with the ground, he was Rude Krishy again, walking with the survivors of Adun class, no different from any of them. The tower's portal held open for an hour. Students came through in groups. Someone had a count. Everyone was accounted for, minus the teacher who had arranged the whole thing and who was now in a dragon. Dio was alive. He was found at the bottom of the canyon, standing unhurt on a black rock shelf, with no injury and no explanation for how he had survived the fall that should have ended him. He accepted a survival blanket from a tower mage and said nothing to anyone about how he had gotten there. Rude watched him from 20 paces. Dio's back was to him. His hair was matted from the fall. Something in the set of his shoulders was wrong, in a way that Rude had not seen before, and was having difficulty naming. He smelled wrong, or rather he smelled of nothing, in the way a room smells of nothing when the window has been open for a long time and all its own air has gone out. Rude said nothing. He filed it away with everything else. The school came back from Ishwela in the late afternoon, when the light over the hill had gone orange and the gates of Helios looked exactly as they had when everyone left. Same guards at the door, same ivy, same marble spires. Every student who walked through the gate did it with the particular careful steadiness of a person checking that the ground is solid before putting weight on it. The headmistress was waiting in the main hall. She was a small woman with gray hair and the bearing of someone who had spent a long career managing the space between what officially happened and what the records said had happened. She did not raise her voice. She announced that there had been an incident during the field exercise, that the academy took the matter very seriously, that Professor Hale was unavailable for comment, and that an external investigation team would arrive within the week. She said the school year would continue without disruption. She said this in the tone of a person who found the phrase without disruption deeply useful. No one asked where Hale was. The students who had been on the island had reached a silent collective agreement that the full shape of that afternoon was not going to come out of any of their mouths in any form that could be quoted. Rude spent the first 2 days after Ishwela trying to reach his master. The crystal connected twice, both times for under 20 seconds. What came through in the first window was the master's voice stripped of its usual theatrical warmth, asking if Rude was intact. Rude said yes. The master said good, said the situation was complicated, said Rude should hold his position and under no circumstances reveal himself to any investigation team. The connection broke on the word team. The second window gave 8 seconds and an instruction to stay small, then silence. He set the crystal on his windowsill and watched the courtyard. Raoul appeared at his elbow the following morning as he came around a corridor corner, matching his pace before he had registered her arrival. She said, in the voice she used for seminars, that she had a new theory about him. She said she had spent the Ishwela affair thinking about a boy she had seen in an auction hall some weeks back. She said she had been professionally interested in that boy's mana signature. She said she would like a formal demonstration from this particular 7th class student in the next practical session, to properly assess his technique. Rude told her he would do his best. She told him she was certain of it. She walked away and turned the corner, and he thought about how many first-class mages were currently inside this school and whether the number would grow. It grew. On the 5th day, the Magic Tower's investigation team came through the gates. 4 mages, the lead arriving last, sharp green eyes, pressed coat. He looked at the courtyard, the spires, the students crossing the grass, and his gaze settled on each thing for exactly the time it took to understand it, no more. His name was Orphle. He walked into Helios as if entering a room where a fire had started, and the useful question was not why, but what next. His subordinate Dion wore the permanent expression of a man on a worse assignment than he deserved, which was the expression he wore at everything. Orphle's team installed a monitoring station in the East Faculty Wing and asked for class schedules, transit circle preparation records, and a list of every faculty member with access to the practice hall. The headmistress gave them everything with the smoothness of someone who had anticipated this and had already decided how much of everything she intended to provide. Rude watched from the edge of the courtyard on their first morning and noted that Orphle spent 6 seconds looking at the dormitory building. Not the hall, not the faculty wing, the dormitory, where 2 7th-class students lived in the same room. He thought about how many Eden students had seen something in Ishwela that started with the word blow and went back inside. The Duchess's letter arrived in the 2nd week. He read it in the dormitory bathroom with the door locked. 2 pages. The first was a formal extension of the contract, ongoing, no fixed end date. The second had no legal language. She had received a report from a private magical examiner, written in careful and specifically worded terms, describing a mana signature detected in Lettuces at a routine family checkup the previous year. The signature was dark. Not dark the way an unusual affinity was dark, dark in the specific way Rude's own mana was dark. The examiner had noted a suppressed mage's mark, hidden deep, and a reservoir of power the mark was barely containing. She had written at the bottom, in her own hand. She did not know what this meant. She wrote that she was frightened. Rude folded the letter and sat on the edge of the bath and looked at the tile floor. He thought about the spectral figure over Lettuce's sleeping form. He thought about Minus's hands reaching for the boy on the floating island with the hunger of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. He thought about a ritual that had gone to extraordinary lengths to get one specific person into the right location. He needed to know what was in there. That night, after Lettuces had been asleep for an hour, Rude sat up. He waited in the quiet for another 10 minutes, listening to the room settle. Then he reached across the gap between the beds and set 2 fingers lightly on Lettuce's temple. His dark mana moved without instruction. It followed a pull below thought, the way a compass needle follows north without being asked. He felt the mark's shape, large, old in the way something can be old in a person who is 15, as if it had always been there rather than awakened at a fixed point. Inside it ran a current. Slow and enormous and thoroughly closed, the way a river waits behind a dam whose stones are cracking at the base. Lettuce's eyes opened. The dark mana snapped back. Rude sat upright with both hands in his lap and the specific expression of someone who had not been doing anything. Lettuces stared at him. The room was very quiet. A long pause assembled itself between them. Rude said, with some care, that he had been checking the temperature near the window. Lettuces looked at him with the full, unhurried attention of a person who has just woken up and has nothing preventing them from examining a situation completely. He told Rude, in a voice still thick from sleep, that Rude's fingers had been on his face. Rude acknowledged this and said the temperature varied more than people expected across a room this size, which was a structural observation he found genuinely interesting. Lettuces pulled his blanket up, told Rude he was a strange person, and faced the wall. The conversation was over. Rude lay in the dark and thought about a dam with cracking stones and how much time he had before someone other than him felt what was behind it. Eel cornered him the next afternoon in the quiet corridor he used between the library and the seminar wing. She stepped from a doorway and fell into step without ceremony. She said she had seen 2 threads of dark mana in Ishwela, one from Rude, one from Lettuces, rising involuntarily in the moment Hale's hands came toward him. She said she had studied mana signature identification as part of her Harris coursework. She asked what Rude thought about Lettuces. He told her he thought Lettuces was a good roommate. She held his gaze and told him she was not asking about temperament. He said he had nothing else to add. She nodded once, as if that answer confirmed something she had already worked out, and at the doorway she stopped without turning and said she would not discuss what she had seen with anyone on the investigation team. She said she wanted him to know that. He watched her go. 2 first-class mages in the building, a demon network still running agents, a tower investigation conducting daily faculty interviews, and the top student in the year had just quietly told him she had seen through both of them and chosen a side. He was not sure whether that was reassuring. It was something. The freshman welcome party was the headmistress's idea. She announced it at morning assembly with the brightness of a person who believed the best treatment for a wound was to put the furniture back in the room quickly. Ren came to Rude 2 days beforehand and sat on the edge of his desk. She said Letisis had been walking these halls as the abomination for 2 months. She said the uniform he wore, and the way he wore it, and how he kept his hair, had been inside that story long enough that students saw the story first and Letisis behind it, if they saw him at all. She said a new face would not change the school, but it might change the room. 3 days before the party, Ren cut his hair. She did it in the bathroom with scissors borrowed from the craft room and the total focused attention of someone who believed in the work. Letisis sat on the edge of the bath and did not look at the mirror. Halfway through, he asked her why she was doing this. She said she was tired of watching him walk with his head down. He was quiet for a long time. She kept cutting. When she finished, she turned him toward the glass. He looked at himself without speaking. His face without the curtain of hair was younger and less armored, and he had the expression of someone encountering an unfamiliar room in a house they had lived in for years. Eel, who Ren had recruited without consulting Rude, produced a set of small uniform alterations, nothing dramatic, adjustments of fit and collar that took something worn as camouflage and made it look chosen. The night of the party, Letisis walked into the east ballroom with Ren at his side and Eel 3 steps behind. He was not announced. The effect was not a gasp, it was a hesitation, a slight collective pause in the room's movement. The kind that happens when something does not fit the pattern the eye had loaded for the space. Students turned to see a boy they half recognized and could not fully place, and in the gap between those 2 recognitions, the story lost its grip for a moment. By the end of the evening, 6 students who had never spoken to him had spoken to him. 4 more nodded at him in the hall on the way out. None of them were being brave or performing anything. They had done it because the boy in the room looked like someone you could nod at, and that was all Ren had been working toward. Far from the academy, Lord Linos of the association sat at a long table in a stone building with no natural light and listened to a report. He was a composed man whose patience expressed itself as a total absence of visible impatience. He heard the report of Ishwela. He heard Orphal's name. He set one finger on the table surface with great gentleness and pressed down, and a crack ran from his fingertip to the far edge of the stone. He said the situation at Helios lacked productive chaos. He wanted more. 2 days later, Shik Muon was given an illusion earring and the name Ajahn Baldwin, and a transfer record assembled through 3 intermediary institutions. He held the earring between 2 fingers and looked at it the way he looked at things he had not asked for but would use. He put it on. He arrived at Helios the following week with his mana held deliberately low, which required active concentration, the way walking slowly requires a very large dog to think about it. The gate guard checked his papers and waved him through. On the 2nd floor of the faculty wing, Orphal watched him cross the courtyard through a window and said nothing. He had the look of a man who has introduced a variable into an experiment and is curious about the reaction. The Duchess came the same afternoon. She came without announcement and sat in the visiting room and sent word upstairs. Letisis came down and sat across from her and waited. She told him she had come to ask again. She said she could arrange continued education at home, private tutors, and the school's board would not resist a request from her. She said she wanted him somewhere she could see him. He looked at his hands. After a long pause, he told her he did not want to come home. She waited. He said he liked it there. He said the word with care, as if testing its weight, and it held. He said he had people he ate with at breakfast, and someone who had explained at length why the east dormitory window let in cold air from a particular angle. He had disagreed with the explanation, but found the conversation interesting. He said he would like to stay. She sat very still. Her gloves were folded in her lap and she did not move them. After a moment she nodded and said she was glad, in the voice of a person receiving something they had stopped expecting and were now holding very carefully. Rude heard the summary from Ren that evening. He stood at the dormitory window, looking at the courtyard. He said that was good. He said it the way practical people say things that are also true. The Harris students who decided to test the new transfer came out on a Tuesday. 3 of them, which was 2 more than necessary, but 1 fewer than it would have taken to feel safe. They found Shik Muon in the courtyard after evening classes, spread across his path, one with a dense green magic stone charge already active in his palm, loaded before he left the building, which meant the decision had been made in advance. He threw it without warning, directly at the new student's back. The stone dissolved off a flat barrier of suppressed dark mana and dropped to the ground in fragments. Letisis stood behind Shik Muon. He had come around the east corner at an angle that put him between the stone and its target, and his hand was at his side, fingers loose the way Rude's were after a controlled release. The stone Rude had charged for Lapis was in his other hand, its surface dulled from use. He had been carrying it since Ishwela. He had charged it himself at some point in the last 2 weeks without telling anyone, and he had used it with enough precision to strip one targeted attack out of the air without the barrier spreading past its edges. The 3 Hera students stared at him. Letisis stared back. His face was not angry. It had the quality of a person who had made a decision before they left the room and had arrived exactly where they decided to arrive. On the faculty wing's 2nd floor, Orphle lowered a barrier he had raised over the window and looked at the courtyard for a long time. He had anticipated the ambush and chosen not to intervene, hoping Shik Muon would lose control of himself in response and discredit the association's position. He had not calculated for Letisis. He turned from the window. Rude, at a ground-floor corridor window with a clear sightline, let out a breath he had been holding for 40 seconds. He looked at the small figure standing behind Shik Muon with a charged stone in its hand and thought about a dam with cracking stones. He thought about how much longer the stones would hold. Then someone grabbed his shoulder and turned him. His hand came up by reflex and stopped 2 inches from Dio's face. Dio had him by the collar. Not a friendly sleeve touch, not the easy grab of someone who talked with his hands. He had a fistful of collar at the throat, and he had pushed Rude straight back into the wall, and his face was very close. His left eye was the usual brown of a student who had been through Ishwela and had opinions about breakfast. His right eye was not. The pupil had gone vertical, a clean red and black slit, the kind that belonged in the face of something that did not typically wear a face like this one. It had not been there a second before. The pressure of Dio's grip on his collar was one thing. Behind it was a second pressure, not mana, not exactly, something that lived in the same neighborhood as mana and had sharper edges, a force that was not entirely contained. Dio's breathing was controlled but effortful, the way someone breathes when they have been carrying something heavy for long enough to be tired. His voice was his own, the same easy register, but something ran underneath it that did not belong to the boy who had given Rude a gossip tour of the school on the first afternoon. He told Rude that being near that person made it hard to hold on. From the direction of his good eye, Rude understood he meant Shik Muon, standing in the courtyard 30 meters behind them. Dio said this as a fact, without apology, the way someone reports a weather condition they did not choose. He said he had been managing it. He said the 2 weeks since Ishwela had been longer than they looked from the outside. The grip tightened 1 increment. He told Rude to act as though he knew nothing. He said it directly, looking at Rude with the mismatched eyes, the brown one and the red slit one, and the meaning was not ambiguous. He said if Rude could do that, everything would be fine. He said if Rude could not, he was not confident he could keep holding on. He said this last part very quietly, which was worse than if he had said it loudly. The grip released. Dio stepped back 2 paces. The corridor was empty in both directions. The window at the far end held the last light of the evening going out of the sky. Rude stood against the wall with his collar slightly askew and looked at the person who had been his first friend at this school and who had, until 30 seconds ago, seemed to be the most ordinary thing in it. Dio's right eye was brown again. He smoothed his jacket front. He gave Rude the same expression he had used in their first conversation, open, at ease, the look of someone with too much information and no particular place to put it. He said goodnight. He walked to the far end of the corridor and turned the corner without looking back. Rude stayed at the wall. The investigation was running in the faculty wing. Raoul had a watching brief on every practical he attended. Shik Muon was seated in his classroom with his mana held low, and his attention on Rude each time Rude came within 20 meters. Orphle had green eyes and the patient precision of someone who had already filled in most of the form and was waiting for the last signature. The Demon Network had placed 2 agents into the school by 2 separate paths, and the second had swallowed the first before the first could say a name. And somewhere in the student body, a girl with reptile slit eyes was still writing letters to Ruby Messier about how boring the classes were. And the boy who had been dead last in the year rankings, who had known everyone's secrets from week 1, who smelled of nothing and fell off floating islands without dying, had just pinned Rude to a wall with a red slit pupil and told him to pretend. Rude pushed off the wall. He straightened his collar. He walked back toward the dormitory at his usual pace, running 7 problems in the order of their urgency, sorting which ones could be managed and which could only be survived, and whether any of them were the same problem in different clothes. He thought about a river behind a dam with cracking stones. He thought about his master's voice on a crystal with 8 seconds left, saying, "Stay small." He reached the dormitory door and held still with his hand on the latch. The courtyard behind him was quiet. Somewhere inside, Letisis was probably awake, the way he was often awake when the room was too still. Somewhere outside the gates, the night was full of things already in motion that did not require his permission. He thought about a hooded figure dissolving in his fist and 2 words left in the dark. "It is coming soon." He opened the door and went in.